Welcome to Illuminating Hope, a podcast of Hope House. We are starting a series, Understanding Domestic Violence. Knowledge is Empowerment. The podcast series dedicated to uncovering the truth about domestic violence and empowering you with the tools and knowledge to create change. In this series, we'll explore the many dimensions of domestic violence: physical, emotional, psychological, financial, and beyond. Each episode is designed to educate, challenge misconceptions, and provide actionable insight for individuals, families, and communities. Because the more we understand, the more equipped we are to recognize the signs, support survivors, and prevent domestic violence. Tracey, welcome back to the Illuminating Hope podcast. I know we had you here for our first episode when we talked about the domestic violence wheel, and we're so glad to have you back.
Well, thank you for having me.
The last time you were here, we talked about how the domestic violence wheel is set up and the 8 spokes that are within the wheel. We talked about how all the forms of domestic violence, we talked about it being almost like a web, an entangled web, because often coercion is leading to threats, which leads to emotional abuse, and so on and so on. But today we want to talk about using intimidation, minimizing, denying, and blaming, using children, and using privilege. So using intimidation is a tactic using violence that maybe has been perpetrated in the past or threats of future violence. Can you tell me, is there any examples of that from any of your groups that you can speak to?
So the intimidation could be looks, it could be actions, it could be behaviors to get the victim to keep her from doing something or to get her compliance. And so some of those looks and behaviors may not even be noticeable to other people, but when a victim learns very quickly what those tells are that says that abuser is going to be exploding and where he's at in the cycle. Their whole life is about where is the abuser at in the cycle of violence. Is he in a good place? Everything is dependent on that, in whether how safe they're going to be, what they can ask for, what they can talk about. And so they learn very quickly what their looks might mean, even how they sit in the chair, what that means, how they walk in the door. Is this going to be a good night? This is going to be a bad night? Those gestures, behaviors, yes, they keep them in compliance, because what it means, if they punch the wall next to you, no, they're not punching you, but it means you could be next. And it's all meant to put you in fear so that you're going to do what they want you to do. And so when I've been down at court with clients, and even when the abuser walks in, they will get panicky about, and he looks fine to everybody else, like we're not noticing, but they know. They know that look in his eye, they know the way he walks, they know, and they'll say, he's really angry, but not noticeable to anybody else, but certainly keeps the victim in line and doing what they want her to do just by looks and gestures.
You brought up the domestic violence cycle. There are 3 stages of this cycle of violence. So first you have the tension building phase, and then the actual explosion or incident that would happen. And then thirdly is the honeymoon stage. Can you explain that a little bit?
When you start out the relationship, everything seems great. I mean, abuse doesn't happen the first time you go out on a date. And so he seems to your knight in shining armor, and everything seems great, and this is who you've always wanted. And the relationship moves very quickly because the abuser has to get you invested in the relationship before he really shows you who he really is. And so the relationship moves quickly, and you may move in together or get pregnant very quickly or isolate yourself from everybody. Once he shows his true colors, what you start to see is that honeymoon phase, which is when every words and actions meet, that's when they're the person you always knew they could be, start making promises, and then you start to see that tension building where victims feel like they're walking on eggshells. They know something's coming, but they're not really sure what, and there may be a lot of trying to pacify, like, how can I stop this from occurring? Because I know something's going to happen. And then eventually there's going to be an outburst. first, either physically or verbally, and then going back to, I'm sorry, I won't do this again, I'm going to quit hanging out with people, I'm going to quit drinking. And so during that honeymoon phase, at least in the beginning of the relationship, there's that hope. That's what keeps victims in the relationship, is that idea that, okay, he is going to change, he's going to stop doing those things. He did apologize. And so that's the cycle of violence.
If we go back to when an abuser uses intimidation, the goal of the abuser using that intimidation is basically to overcome or control any resistance in the home, basically, so that everyone would become compliant. I feel like the only option a survivor has are very few when they meet up with somebody who is using intimidation. And that would be to do what the abuser wants you to do so you don't have the consequences, possibly, to leave or to push back. And we know the two latter could be very harmful. 75% of the homicides happen when a survivor tries to leave or has left a relationship. Or you don't know what harm can happen if you would, being a reasonable person, stand up to someone who is using some kind of intimidation against you. But really, the survivor only has those options, and none of them seem like they're a good and healthy option.
The intimidation is going to keep you from leaving in many instances. And it may not be necessarily just threats to your bodily harm, but threats to, I'm going to take the kids, I'm going to call Children's Division, have the kids removed. I mean, the intimidation is not just to your physical health. It could be, I'm going to call your work, get you in trouble, I'm going to call the police. So there's a lot of different intimidation tactics that abusers can use to keep you doing what they want you to do, where you don't feel like you have any other options.
And that brings us to when an abuser uses children. And this happens so much. We see this so much within our organization. I know in many cases, the abuser will see how much that survivor loves those children.
Yes, they're going to use whatever vulnerability the victim has, and their children are the biggest vulnerability. So, and certainly use the children as a pawn once you leave the relationship. And the children are what often keeps women there. That idea that the kids need their dad, I can't take the kids away from their dad. And when I work with moms, I'll say, well, if you wouldn't want your daughter to marry someone like their dad, or you wouldn't want your son to be like him, he's probably not as great of an influence as you think. But again, that idea that I maybe didn't have a dad, so at least they have a dad. But the games that they play with the kids, which trying to make sure the kids see their side of it, they're the only legitimate parent, that mom's got to be the bad guy, especially when kids go to visits. It's, I'm going to let them do whatever they want to do, because that makes me the good parent and makes mom the bad guy, because she has to then pull them back into some consistency. And so there's a lot of games that get played in domestic violence with the kids.
And that visitation is a key component of that. So that's after the relationship, after they've left the relationship. We have a whole program, the Guardian program, which is around the visitation. That's also, even if they're not involved in our Guardian program, not returning kids when they're supposed to return the kids is a huge tactic that's used, and it's a threat. Look, if you don't do what I tell you to do, you're not going to get your kids back. I'm going to keep them. Or the other one would just not taking the kids when it's their turn, just never knowing where they are, in their cycle. Like, what is this person going to do next? But not bringing them back is a huge, often that's a threat that will get someone to be, quote, unquote, in compliance with what they want.
Yeah, the visitation is a big one. And the idea, if you're separated, these are my kids, therefore you better pick up the phone every time I call. I work with, large part of my caseload is moms that are in child custody, going through child custody court, and their fear remains once they leave that relationship. Like, I better answer the phone whenever he calls, I better let him talk to the kids, or he's saying that I'm alienating the kids from him. And so giving the victims permission to say, no, you don't have to answer the phone every 5 minutes just because somebody's calling you. There are other options. But their fear is so great that he's going to take them to court, he's going to get the kids, and she's not going to see them, and he's going to have them full time. Really, it's exhausting, and it keeps her still under his control and doing what he wants her to do. It's a relevant fear that victims have. And if he's not a safe person, I may return to him. because I can keep the kids safe, but if I'm not with them, are they safe when they're with him?
Custodial parent has to follow the court orders, and they have to follow the things that the judge has put into place, because otherwise then they're held in contempt and they're the ones that are going to get into trouble. So they are very, very valid fears, and we know that that exchange of children is a very dangerous time as well, which is, again, why we have our guardian program, because that's a time that they know that they are going to have a captive audience. They have to exchange the children, and if they don't exchange the children, then all they have to do is go back, and then the custodial parent looks like the bad guy and saying, wait a minute, why didn't you follow this order? Well, because it's very dangerous to follow that order.
And we know offending parents will do just the minimum above or what they shouldn't be doing so that she can report it, but it's going to look like, well, you're just nitpicking. So what, he brought him back 10 minutes late. Well, we know it's a power and control thing, but to the courts, they're not going to mess with just these little infractions or showing up somewhere where he's not supposed to be. It's not his time, where he can go to the judge and go, well, I just wanted to see my kids, or can easily explain it away. When she's trying to bring this up, it looks like she's just nitpicking. She's just trying to get him in trouble if you're not looking at it from a power control aspect. They often, when they're doing the parenting plans, are going to make it as difficult as possible for exchanges, making sure that it's at an inconvenient time for her, that it's always the victim that has to exchange the kids, whatever they can do just to continue to maintain that control over her, even when they're not together. And it's surprising the number of times that I will have to give women the permission to not allow him in the house. They're not living together. It's not his house, but she's so conditioned that if he shows up, she has to let him in, just to give that permission that he doesn't control. He doesn't need to come in your house. He doesn't live here. He doesn't control you anymore. It's just what they're used to. If he says it's a certain way, they tend to believe it's that way.
One of the other things that we've been hearing about is using the children by planting tracking devices in their backpacks or in their diaper bags, or something that the abuser knows is going to go back with that child, but then the custodial parent isn't aware that that's happening. So we really have had to also do some safety planning around making sure that you're looking for those kind of devices, because then when they just show up and then they're like, oh, I just showed up, knowing that the family was going to be there because they have a tracking device, but to be able to just say, well, they were just at the grocery store. I'm allowed to go to the grocery store. And again, that's using that intimidation and that threat, but also using the children in order to accomplish that as well. So it's one of those newer things that, as technology changes and advances, I've always said that a lot of the things that have happened technology-wise that have been such great inventions for us and have made life easier, or being able to monitor where your children are and knowing that they're safe, but then those also can be used, for the bad when an abusive person is using it to control.
And there's a lot of hypervigilance that goes along with being a domestic violence victim, and it can look like paranoia. So when they show up wherever you're at, again, they can easily explain it away. Oh, I didn't know she was going to be here. Or again, the victim can look like you're just paranoid. You're just looking for a problem. And it can be that they are tracking them, or we have them send iPads with kids to have tracking devices on them.
I think the ultimate use of children is when the non-custodial abuser actually murders the kids. There is no more extreme way for the abusive partner to get back, or to control their victim or their spouse, because they have used those children to that. And the threat, the number of times that they make that threat, that I will do this to those kids, that will paralyze someone or put them in such a state of fear that they don't feel like they have any other choice. And it seems so extreme, but we see that all. I mean, you pick up the newspaper or, watch the news and you hear about kids being used that way. And sometimes it's a murder-suicide, but sometimes it's a murder. And thinking, what better way can I get back at her but to take her kids away from her permanently?
And we have women that also, when we talk about not necessarily murder, but the visitation and then throwing out a little bit of information. We had a client in shelter who had a baby that he had for visitation, and he called, was telling her this baby was in the hospital in serious condition. Wouldn't tell her where the baby was, wouldn't tell her what was wrong with the baby. So we spent all weekend trying to find this baby at the hospital, and the baby wasn't even in the hospital. But it was just that emotional hostage, like, okay, I'll give you a little bit of information so you can worry all weekend, but I'm not going to tell you everything. And that happens a lot, giving a little bit of information, doing things with the kids, but taking them to the doctor but not telling her what's wrong with them.
And using those kids to get information as well. Casually dropping questions or hints or things and trying to get information about her that maybe he didn't have to begin with. And so then now he knows about a friend or a new job or they're moving, or it's really amazing the different ways that they can use the kids to be able to continue to control.
And that swings right into more of the using privilege. It's when the abuser feels like they are entitled to control their survivor.
I think most abusers have that idea that they are more powerful, and our society kind of supports the idea that men are more important than women are. I'd like to think we are getting beyond that, but I don't know. It's still a work in progress. That women are overreactive and that men make better decisions. And so when you get in a domestic violence situation, I think that's just perpetuated. That I need to make all the decisions, that I'm the smarter one, that I know everything. I may not know where my child goes to school or what doctor, but I'm going to tell you how that child should be educated, and I'm going to tell you all about their medical conditions. So, and that's also, certain communities feel that more strongly. Certain cultures feel that more strongly, that the man is in charge and you do what he says.
And I think when you look at the cultural beliefs, that if you have a situation where you have a couple that have an agreement about what the roles are going to be, if somebody says, I really want to be the one to make these decisions and you're going to be the one to do this, if there's an agreement, that is very, very different than one person using the situation and elevating their power and elevating their control over the other person where there isn't that agreement, where they didn't agree that that's the way it was going to be, or they didn't say, but if I don't do these things, then you can do this. I think we want to just make sure that we talk about the fact that when you have a difference in power and you have a difference in control and you have someone in the relationship that's doing things to control another person, that is very, very different than there being an agreement between roles. Because it's really okay if somebody is in agreement and says, I want to be a stay-at-home mom and I'm okay doing the dishes and I do the laundry and those things that our society says are typically the women's role and the men's role is this. If that agreement is there and there's an understanding and they came to it together, that is very, very different than someone using those positions of power and using them for control. We want to make sure that we make that distinction.
Right.
So using privilege is telling the survivor what to do instead of negotiating an outcome together, basically.
Right. Well, and using the culture, that's a very common, there's a lot of spiritual beliefs that come from different religions, different spiritual thoughts that say, the man is the one in control, the man's the one empowered. But again, you come back to how that comes to an agreement with somebody, if that agreement is there, or if it's not there. We haven't talked about that spiritual abuse. We want to get into that, we can, but that's often where that's used as well.
Yeah, just the idea that there are certain denominations that highly believe that men are next to God and that women are under them and the men are the ones that make the decisions in the household and that everything has to go through them, and that it's said that way through biblical passages, and that the church that they belong to holds those beliefs also. And so if the victim doesn't agree with those, then they must not be faithful enough.
And if somebody is in agreement with that and that is their belief system and they agree to the terms of the marriage, then that's very different than someone who says, wait a minute, I'm not sure that I do believe that, and then using that religion against them and using those spiritual practices against them, again, to hold them, if you don't do this, then God's not going to love you, or whatever. You're not a good Christian, you're not a good whatever it is that they're talking about. I think, again, it just comes back to one person maintaining control over the other through various methods. That is not an equal relationship. That is not where they come together as partners and have an agreement about who's going to be what in what role.
And when you're talking about religious abuse, it's not just within this family, it's those beliefs are upheld by that church community that they're part of or the faith community they're part of. There's just not room for you to have your own thoughts about. You are inclined to not just do what your husband's telling you to do, but that's upheld by everybody else within this faith community who's going to back him up when he's saying, well, she's just getting out of line. One of the other things when we talked about privilege that abusers do is also to give minimal information to the victim that she's trying to make a decision about, keeping on some of the information. So she's making decisions without all of the information she needs so that when it fails, he can turn around and say, see, you can't even make a decision for yourself, or giving her wrong information to make those decisions, as a way of just upholding his idea that, well, I have to make that. I'm smarter than you are. I know more than you are.
You're not capable.
You're not capable.
You're not capable of making such decisions, and here's proof of that.
And that's that intertwining web that we were talking about. That is domestic violence, because now we're minimizing and denying and blaming. Okay, you're not smart enough, so it is all your fault. If something does not go the abuser's way or the perpetrator's way, they shift the blame of any kind of incident on her. Let's say they're at the grandparents' house and the children are acting up. The blame often gets shifted to, well, if you were a better parent, or if she was a better parent in front of the grandparents, then these kids would not be acting up. So when there's a lot of blame shifting, do you think that it's a safety mechanism that some survivors will take the blame on before they are blamed so they can fix the problem? They have to stay so many steps ahead. Have you ever seen any instances like that?
Well, I think, the victim, at least in the beginning of the relationship, is all about, how can I fix this? What can I do? I must have done something wrong. I'm going to pacify, do whatever I can to make him happy. And once you're longer in the relationship, you realize that you can't be perfect enough to stop the abuse. So the denying piece of it is just the idea that, I didn't do anything. I don't know what you're talking about. And you might, as a victim, be standing there with blood on your face or a bruise, and they will still say, I didn't do it. And that's so frustrating to a victim who's like, the proof is right there. And part of the problem is that if you are a typical person who has morals and values and has guilt and shame, you cannot understand how somebody else cannot have those feelings and could lie to you or look at you, this person that they're supposed to love who's bleeding, and just say, I didn't do it. Don't know what you're talking about. You're just crazy. And it's such a surreal feeling to not be able to figure out, why would they say that, or why don't they feel bad for that? So there's a lot of, it must be me, or I feel the whole thing is crazy making. But when the denying it doesn't work, or they will move on to, well, okay, I did it, but you're just overreacting because I didn't hit you that hard, or you have bruises because you bruise easily, or you just want to get me in trouble. All of that is just, okay, I'll agree it happened, but it's not that big of a deal. And then the blaming, well, okay, I did hurt you, but it was your fault because you should have known not to do this, or you should have known not to do that. Or, none of it is taking accountability for anything that's occurred. It's all putting it back. And when you as a victim hear that over and over again, you just start to believe, well, maybe there is something wrong with me. And number one, because I'm still here, but two, I just cannot wrap my head around why he would do these things, so maybe there is something. Maybe I am crazy. Maybe it didn't happen. Maybe I did really fall instead of him pushing. It all becomes distorted in your reality of what really occurred.
And I think starting to question, okay, I did do that, you're right, I did that, so if I would have done this, then I could have stopped it, or if I would have done this. But the problem with that is that changes all of the time. They move the goalpost all of the time.
All the time.
Because it could be that this time they wanted you to do this, but then when you do that the next time, they're like, wait a minute, I don't want you to do that. That's where, that crazy making, as you were talking about, that there's never any sense, there's no rhyme or reason to what they're saying to you, their actions, because it changes all of the time. And that's what also keeps them paralyzed, because they're like, I can't do anything because I don't know what's going to happen. I won't do it right. I'm not going to do anything, but then that's not okay either. So there's just really there's no way to win in these situations at all. Win may not be the right word, but there's no way to ever be what that person expects you to be. You'll never be able to do that.
And you'll never get ahead of the abuse, because the core of the abuse is power and control. And that is what that abuser is seeking, is that power and control.
So the abusers go from one end of the spectrum, which is, I am the victim, you need to take care of me, I'm nothing without you, you know I can't do any better, which pulls victims into an emotional hostage, like, okay, now I feel bad, and I shouldn't have been so hard on him, and he's doing the best he can. And then if that doesn't work, or at the same time, they flip to, well, you better do what I want, or there's going to be a consequence. So they go from one extreme to the other. They don't have the ability to be that middle ground, which is, this is my perception, you have your perception, let's come to a compromise, because we know then they wouldn't have any power. So it has to be victim or controller. Both are controlling, but one or the other. But either one is as powerful. So they don't have that ability also to have any empathy, right? So that makes them pretty much open to doing whatever they want to do without any thought or consequence. And it's all about what meets their immediate needs. So that's why it changes, right? Today my need is for you to do these things. Well, tomorrow that's going to change. Now my need's going to be something else. Nothing is ever going to be consistent because it's changing every day and according to the abuser's whim, which also happens with children. They go from that victim with the kids too, that neglectful, just do whatever you want when you're with me, I don't care as long as it's not interfering with what I'm doing, you can be jumping off bed, until it bothers them. Kids get in a fight and then all hell's going to break loose. Somebody's going to get it, but there's not a long-term parenting plan. It's whatever in that moment. So that's why visitation can be very dangerous, because there's no supervision. They are doing whatever, but then when there is discipline, it's overreaction. Everybody walks on eggshells because nobody knows.
If this conversation resonates with one of our listeners, you had talked about groups. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about what those groups are, what groups that we offer, and then how one would actually get into one of the groups?
We have support groups that meet almost every day of the week. But the groups that I do is I do a 6-week domestic violence and parenting group. The aim is for moms that have children's division involvement, but anybody can attend and get something out of it. But we talk about the power and control wheel, red flags of abuse, the cycle of violence, safety planning, how abusive partners parent, and then moving on from the relationship. Why we get into the relationships we get into and why we stay. And so for the women that attend that, they get a lot out of it, because the power and control wheel, they may not even recognize some of the things on there were abuse. They know the big ones, but it's enlightening to them to be able to see that they weren't crazy, that the stuff they experienced wasn't their fault. And I often have victims that will say, oh, do you know my abuser? Because abusers tend to use the same tactics. And so it can be like, wow, you're really talking to me. You really understand what I've been through. My groups are all on Zoom, but the group that's 8 o'clock is very similar to the DV and parenting group, but it's aimed for clients that are going through the child custody system. But I can't change the system today. So what I can do is help you to prepare for it, help you to understand it so that you can get through it in the best way possible. The same sessions as the 6-week group, but we also add topics in there such as, how do you hire an attorney? What things do you ask? What is your realistic expectations for your attorney? How to get through the process, how to cope with the process, how to communicate with your abusive partner in an effective manner that doesn't pull you back into the abuse. So we add those kind of topics into that one. And then I also do a support group on Thursday nights at 6 for moms. Any moms can attend, but again, it's aimed at moms that are going through child custody. They're really struggling through all of the ups and downs of court processes, very long and very exhausting, and make it very difficult for you to 100% move away from that abusive situation. So the child custody system is a very difficult system to navigate. It's exhausting, overwhelming, and so being able to talk about it with other women who are also going through it is very helpful. Learning what's worked for them. The women that come to that group are all different. They're starting the process. Some have been in the process for a very long time.
There's a lot of comfort when you know you're not alone in a struggle. And it really validates people's story too, the survivor's story. How would somebody get into one of these groups? Do they call our Hope House hotline, or how would that work?
They can call the hotline.
And the hotline's 816-461-HOPE. Tracey, thanks so much for coming on again. We sure appreciate everything you do here at Hope House and the groups that you have, and I've actually learned a little bit more about some of the groups that you do, so that was really good to hear. So just thanks so much for everything you do.
Thank you for having me.